They say every town has its ghosts, but Sleepy Hollow is a ghost. A cold, damp breath on the back of your neck. A whisper of fallen leaves and forgotten sorrows. I came here as Daniel Whitaker, the once celebrated debunker of paranormal hoaxes, now trailing the faint, acrid scent of professional disgrace after that disastrous seance gone viral in New Orleans. I was looking for a quiet, easily dismissed local legend to rebuild my tarnished reputation. Instead, I found the Dreycott House, a rotting colonial ulcer clinging to the edge of the whispering woods. A place that felt ancient and malevolent even under the anemic autumn sun. It came with 3 rules, delivered by a wild-eyed, half-mad pastor whose hands wouldn't stop trembling. Duck from riderless hoofbeats. Leave the house before the 28th day. And if you wake up holding an axe, well, the investigator before me, Dr. Alistair Finch, the one who'd scoffed that the axe was just a manifestation of stress. His chapter in the house's bloody history is still whispered by the flickering gaslights in the old Dutch churchyard, a tale ending abruptly and violently. Sleepy Hollow itself was a masterpiece of curated dread. Gnarled, headless-looking trees clawed at the perpetually overcast sky. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, seemed to muffle sound, creating an unnerving, expectant quiet. And the Dreycott House, set back from the road, half hidden by a tangle of overgrown briars and shadowed by ancient oaks, was its brooding heart. It was a 2-story colonial, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin, its windows dark and vacant as a skull's eyes. A crumbling stone wall encircled an ancient, overcrowded cemetery that abutted the property, its headstones leaning at drunken angles, their inscriptions worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. Pastor Emery Hatch met me at the rusted iron gates of the Dreycott property. He was a scarecrow of a man, his black suit hanging loosely on his bony frame, his eyes wide and startlingly blue in his deeply wrinkled face. They held a disturbing lucidity. "Mr. Whitaker," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across cobblestones. "You came, despite the local reputation." He clutched a worn, leather-bound Bible to his chest as if it were a shield. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. As he fumbled with a large antique iron key to unlock the massive oak front door of the Dreycott House, he pressed a brittle, folded piece of parchment into my hand. The house has its ways, Mr. Whitaker, its rules. For those who dare to linger, if you hear galloping hoofs approaching but see no rider, duck behind the nearest headstone immediately. Never spend more than 28 days investigating the same haunted house. That's when the possession becomes permanent. When you wake up holding an axe in the middle of the night, with no memory of how it got there, you've become the next chapter in the house's murderous history. "Possession," I said, my skepticism a familiar, comforting cloak. "Pastor, with all due respect, ideal and explainable phenomena. This house, Mr. Whitaker," he whispered, his blue eyes boring into mine. "It writes its phenomena. It writes its phenomena. It writes its phenomena to stay too long as its ink." He then pressed a small, tarnished silver disc on a leather thong into my palm. "An old charm. Wear it. It may," muffled the whispers. The interior of Dreycott House was a mausoleum of dust and decay. Rotting damask curtains hung in tatters. Furniture lay shrouded under ghostly white sheets. The air was frigid, despite the lack of any discernible draft, and carried the faint, persistent scent of wood smoke, old paper, and something else, something metallic and coppery, like old, dried blood. As I took my first tentative steps into the grand, cobweb-draped foyer, I saw him, a pale, slender youth, perhaps 17, watching me silently from the shadowy landing of the main staircase. He had dark, haunted eyes and the stillness of a deer about to bolt. Then, as quickly as he'd appeared, he was gone, melting back into the gloom. Eli Dreycott, the groundskeeper, and a descendant, so the Sparstown record said, of the original tragic family. Later, exploring the outbuildings, I found the woodshed. It was damp, a jumble of rotting logs and rusted tools. Tucked away in a dark, cobweb-choked corner, half buried under a pile of moldering sacks, was an axe head. No handle, just a heavy, crescent-shaped blade, its edge surprisingly free of rust. Almost, gleaming faintly in the dim light filtering through the grimy window. It felt cold, unnaturally so, when I touched it. The first few days were a paranormal investigator's dream or nightmare, depending on your threshold for cliché. Doors creaked open and slammed shut in empty rooms. Cold spots drifted like invisible icebergs through the stale air. My audio recorders picked up faint, sighing whispers that the analysis software flagged as anomalous vocalizations. Standard haunted house fare. I meticulously logged it all, my professional skepticism warring with a growing, undeniable sense of unease. The house felt wrong. It felt aware. The galloping hooves came on the fourth night. I was out in the cemetery that bordered the Dreycott property, taking baseline EMF readings near a crumbling, ivy-choked mausoleum. The moon was a sliver, casting long dancing shadows from the ancient headstones. Suddenly, I heard it. The distinct, rhythmic thunder of a horse at full gallop, approaching fast along the narrow, unpaved lane that ran past the cemetery and the house. But as I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, the lane was empty, utterly empty. Rule 1, duck behind the nearest headstone immediately. The pastor's frantic voice echoed in my mind. Dismissing it as an auditory hallucination, a trick of the wind. I hesitated. The galloping grew louder, closer, the ground beneath my feet beginning to vibrate, and then an icy blast of wind, smelling of damp earth, and something else, something fetid and old, slammed into me. At the last possible second, a primal instinct I didn't know I possessed took over. I threw myself sideways, scrambling behind a tall, ornate Victorian headstone, its marble cold against my cheek. An invisible force, immense and powerful, thundered past where I'd been standing. So close I felt the rush of displaced air, the ground shaking violently. The air crackled with a static charge, and the smell of sulfur and something akin to hot iron filled my nostrils. The headstone I was pressed against didn't just tremble. It groaned, a low, resonant sound, as if the stone itself were in pain. Then, as quickly as it came, the sound of the hooves receded into the distance, leaving behind only a ringing silence and the frantic pounding of my own heart. The next morning, I sought out Clara Mondes. She was the official town historian, and somewhat incongruously, the keeper of the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery keys. I found her in her small, cluttered office above the town's tiny library, surrounded by stacks of brittle books and faded maps. She was in her early 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, and a wary, almost defensive air when I introduced myself. "Another one," she'd said, not unkindly, but with a weary sigh. "Come to chase the Headless Horseman and get your 15 minutes of cable TV fame, Mr. Whitaker." "Something like that," I admitted, deciding against mentioning the invisible stampede. "I'm interested in the Dreycott House. Its history?" Clara's expression became guarded. "The Dreycott House has a lot of history, most of it unhappy." She was reluctant to share, deflecting my questions with vague answers about colonial land disputes and tragic illnesses. But when I mentioned the shifting nature of some of the older headstones in the cemetery plot nearest the house, something I noticed on my preliminary survey, her professional composure wavered for just an instant. A flicker of something, fear, recognition, crossed her face before she quickly masked it. The ground settles unevenly around here, Mr. Whitaker. Old graves. Later that day, I re-examined the headstone I'd hidden behind. It was an elaborate angel, its wings chipped, its stone face sorrowful. Across its base, a fresh, deep scratch, at least an inch wide, marred the weathered marble. It looked for all the world like a massive iron-shod hoof had scraped against it. The house settled into a routine of subtle psychological warfare. Whispers became more distinct, sometimes seeming to mock my recorded questions. Objects, small, insignificant things like a pen, a TEMF reader, would vanish from where I'd left them, only to reappear hours later in bizarre, illogical places. I started having vivid, unsettling dreams. Flickering candlelight, shadowy figures in colonial dress, the glint of steel. A woman's terrified scream abruptly cut off. I'd wake in a cold sweat, the scent of phantom wood smoke clinging to my clothes. Marla Jensen, the town archivist, was a stark contrast to Clara's guardedness. She was a plump, matronly woman in her early 40s, with a warm smile and an encyclopedic knowledge of Sleepy Hollow's every nook and cranny. She welcomed me into the archives, a dusty, book-lined haven in the town hall, and eagerly provided me with stacks of documents. Dreycott family journals filled with looping, increasingly frantic script, newspaper clippings yellowed with age, detailing unexplained disappearances and tragic accidents at the house, coroner's reports that raised more questions than they answered. "It's a sad place, the Dreycott House," Marla said, her voice filled with a gentle, almost motherly concern. "So much sorrow soaked into its very timbers. But your work, Mr. Whitaker, your logical approach, perhaps you'll be the one to finally bring some peace to those troubled spirits. Or at least, understand their story." She seemed genuinely supportive. Yet there was an intensity in her gaze, a subtle, almost imperceptible encouragement for me to dig deeper, to stay longer. The 28th day of my investigation approached like a creeping shadow. Rule 2. The possession becomes permanent. I scoffed at the archaic term, yet a cold knot of anxiety tightened in my gut. Pastor Hatch appeared at the Dreycott gates one raw, drizzly afternoon, looking more agitated than ever, his blue eyes wild. "You're still here," he hissed, gripping my arm with surprising strength. "The house, it's weaving you in, Mr. Whitaker. It's learning your threads. You must leave. Today. The chapter. It needs an ending before it can close properly." He pressed a small, heavy, intricately designed iron key into my hand. It was cold, almost painfully so. This belonged to Ichabod. Or so the legends say. It locks what should not be opened. Or perhaps it unlocks what must be faced, if one is foolish enough. He gave a choked sob and fled, disappearing into the mist-shrouded trees. The memory lapses started subtly. I'd walk into the kitchen of the Dreycott house, then stop, completely forgetting why I'd come. I'd find myself staring at a page in my notes, the words suddenly unfamiliar, as if written by a stranger. My meticulously organized equipment would be slightly out of place. Stress, I told myself. Lack of sleep, the oppressive atmosphere of the house. Explainable phenomena. But one evening, while reviewing audio recordings from a locked, supposedly empty nursery on the second floor, I heard it. Faint, but unmistakable. A child's lullaby, sung in a high, reedy voice. And then, my own voice, humming along. A tune I didn't recognize, a memory I didn't possess. In the dust on a small child-sized rocking chair in that same locked nursery the next morning was a single, fresh, perfectly formed handprint. It was cold to the touch, and far too small to be Eli Dreycott's. I crossed the threshold of the 28th day, a line drawn in invisible ink, a silent countdown reaching its ominous zero. The house seemed to exhale, a contented sigh of ancient timbers and trapped sorrows. The subtle hauntings escalated. The memory lapses were no longer fleeting. They were gaping holes in my day, entire hours vanishing without a trace. My notes became disjointed, my handwriting subtly different in places, more ornate, more archaic. Clara Mendez, noticing my deteriorating state during one of my increasingly infrequent trips into town for supplies, dropped her guarded demeanor. Her worry was palpable. "Daniel," she said, her voice low and urgent. "You look like my great-grandfather did. In the last letter he sent before the Dreycott House took him." She confessed then about her ancestor, a folklorist who had come to investigate the Dreycott legend in the late 1800s, who had stayed too long, whose final, frantic letters spoke of lost time, of a growing darkness within him, of an axe that sang to him in his sleep. Eli Dreycott became a more persistent, if silent, fixture. I'd find him in hallways, watching me with those dark, unreadable eyes. Once he left a single, perfectly preserved, but dead white rose on my pillow. Another time, I found a small, antique child's wooden top placed meticulously in the center of my cluttered research table. Warnings, or something else. He never spoke, just watched, a pale ghost in his own ancestral home. Then came the night. I woke with a gasp, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I was standing, not in my makeshift bedroom in the Dreycott House dusty library, but in the center of the cold, stone-flagged kitchen. The air was frigid, smelling faintly of rust, and something else, something raw and metallic. Disoriented, I fumbled for the flashlight I always kept clipped to my belt. It wasn't there. My hands. Something was in my hands. Heavy. Familiar. I looked down. The axe. Not just the head I'd found in the woodshed, but a complete axe. Its newly hafted wooden handle smooth and worn, fitting my grip with an almost custom-made perfection. My fingers were clamped around it so tightly my knuckles were white. And my hands, they were sticky. A wave of nausea and primal terror washed over me. I stumbled, my fingers fumbling with the light switch on the wall. The bare bulb flickered, then cast a harsh, unforgiving glare over the scene. My hands were stained a dark, glistening crimson. Blood. Fresh blood. Splatters of it arced across the front of my shirt, across the worn stone floor. Rule 3. When you wake up holding an axe in the middle of the night, with no memory of how it got there. I had no memory of picking up the axe. No memory of leaving my room. No memory of leaving my room. No memory of anything. The last thing I remembered was falling into an uneasy sleep. The pastor's iron key clutched in my hand. My gaze flicked to a darkened corner of the kitchen, towards a shadowed shape slumped against the wall. Before I could process, before I could scream, I caught my reflection in the grimy pane of the kitchen window. It was me, yes, but my eyes, in the dim, reflected light, they seemed to glow with a faint, cold, utterly alien blue light. And on my face, a cruel, unfamiliar, almost triumphant smile. The reflection held my gaze for a heart-stopping instant. Then it was just my own terrified face staring back. The blue glow, the smile, gone as if they'd never been. Panic, cold and absolute, clawed at my throat. The axe felt like an extension of my own arm, a horrifying alien limb. The blood on my hands, on the floor. Whose was it? What had I done? The blue glow in my reflected eyes, that predatory smile. It was the house, looking out from within me. I was becoming another chapter. My mind raced. A chaotic jumble of the pastor's warnings, Clara's ancestor's fate, the growing dread that had been my constant companion. I had to get out, had to understand. I let the axe clatter to the stone floor, the sound echoing in the oppressive silence. and stumbled towards the back door, my boots slipping on the slick patches of crimson. As I fumbled with the rusted bolt, a voice, calm and motherly, spoke from the hallway. "Leaving so soon, Daniel? Before you've even finished your work?" Marla Jensen stood there, framed in the archway, her usual warm smile firmly in place. But her eyes, those kindly, maternal eyes, held a new, chilling intensity, a glint of something ancient and predatory. She held a lit oil lamp, its flickering light casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe like living things on the decaying wallpaper. "Marla? What's happening?" I stammered, gesturing wildly at my blood-stained hands, at the axe on the floor. I don't remember. Oh, the house can be a little overwhelming for newcomers," she said, her voice soothing, yet with an underlying current of something that made my skin crawl. "Especially for those who stay past their welcome. It likes to integrate its guests, make them part of the narrative." Clara Mendes appeared behind her, her face pale but resolute. In her hands she clutched a thick leather-bound volume, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. "We found it, Daniel," Clara said, her voice tight with a mixture of horror and grim discovery. "In a hidden compartment behind the loose stone in the library fireplace. The Dreycott manuscript." Marla's smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed slightly. Such resourceful young people, always snooping. "It's a record, isn't it, Marla?" Clara pressed, her voice trembling but firm. "A history of everyone the house has claimed. A history of everyone the house has. Each investigator, each victim, their descent, their chapter." She opened the book, her finger tracing a line of spidery, archaic script. "It describes the lost time, the dreams, the axe. It even mentions Dr. Alistair Finch. The last entry for him ends with a bloody handprint and the words, 'The wood knows my hand now. The steel sings my name.' My blood ran cold. I felt an almost irresistible urge to pick up the axe again, to feel its familiar, terrible weight in my grasp. A fascinating piece of local folklore, wouldn't you agree?" Marla said, her voice still infuriatingly calm. "Sleepy Hollow thrives on its legends, Daniel. It needs them. The Dreycott House, it's the heart of that legend, and like any living thing, it needs to be fed. To be renewed. Fed," I whispered, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. "Fed what, Marla?" "Souls, in a manner of speaking," she conceded, tilting her head. "The house draws power from strong emotions, from secrets, from the culmination of a well-told story." She took a step closer, the lamplight glinting in her eyes. "My ancestors, the first caretakers of this hollow, understood this. They made a pact. They served the house, ensure its vitality, and in return, Sleepy Hollow prospers. Its myths remain potent, drawing in the curious, the seekers, raw material. You're a part of it," I realized, a sickening wave of comprehension washing over me. "The helpful archivist. You guide them here. You make sure they stay long enough. You prepare them." "Every story needs a good editor, Daniel," Marla said, her smile finally taking on a distinctly cruel edge. "Someone to ensure the narrative flows correctly, that the protagonist reaches their inevitable conclusion." Her gaze flicked to the axe, then back to me. "And you, my dear, are poised to write a truly memorable chapter. The famed debunker consumed by the very thing he sought to deny. It's wonderfully ironic." Suddenly, the house itself seemed to roar its approval. The distinct, thunderous sound of riderless hooves erupted from just outside, circling the house, shaking the very foundations. Doors throughout the manor slammed open and shut with violent force. Icy drafts swept through the corridors, carrying with them the whispers of 1,000 tormented voices. The oil lamp in Marla's hand guttered wildly, casting grotesque, leaping shadows. From the darkened corners of the kitchen, Shadowy figures began to coalesce, indistinct at first, then taking on the vague, shifting forms of colonial-era men and women, their eyes burning with a cold, spectral light. They advanced slowly, a silent, menacing audience. "The house is ready for its climax, Daniel," Marla said, her voice rising above the din. "It's time for you to embrace your role." The axe on the floor seemed to thrum, to call to me. I could almost feel its phantom weight in my hand, the satisfying heft of it, the imagined song of its blade through the air. The blue glow flickered at the edge of my vision. "No," Clara cried, stepping in front of me, holding the Dreycott manuscript like a shield. "He's not one of your victims, Marla." Marla laughed, a cold, sharp sound. "Oh, but he already is, dear. The 28th day has passed. The house has made its claim." As if on cue, Eli Dreycott appeared in the opposite doorway, his pale face even more drawn than usual. He wasn't looking at us, but past us towards the main hallway, his eyes wide with a new, fresh terror. He pointed a trembling finger. "Hey, Eli stammered. "The rider. He's inside." The sound of the galloping hooves, impossibly, was now coming from within the house, from the grand foyer, a blast of freezing air, carrying the scent of grave mold and sulfur, swept into the kitchen. And then, a dark, towering silhouette, unmistakably that of a horseman, but headless, holding a gleaming sword, filled the archway from which Marla had entered. It wasn't just a legend. It was here. Marla's eyes widened, not in fear, but in something akin to ecstatic triumph. Yes, the legend completed, the power renewed, but the spectral horseman didn't advance on us. It turned its terrible, unseen gaze towards Marla. What are you doing?" Marla stammered, her confidence faltering. "I am your servant. I brought you this offering." The horseman raised its sword. From within its shadowy form, a low, guttural growl emanated, a sound of ancient, implacable hunger that had nothing to do with reverence or pacts. It was Pastor Hatch, stumbling into the kitchen from a side pantry, his face bloody but his eyes blazing with a desperate holy fire, who shed a horrifying light. He clutched the tarnished silver amulet in one hand and the small iron key in the other. "The house, it doesn't care for servants." "Which?" he croaked, pointing the key at Marla. "It cares only for the story, for the sacrifice, and sometimes the editor becomes the errata." The key in his hand began to glow with a faint, silvery light. The axe at my feet pulsed with a sympathetic, cold blue. The house wasn't just claiming me. It was a chaotic, hungry thing. And Marla, in her arrogance, had forgotten that even the most dedicated servant could become part of the feast. She had orchestrated the finale, but the house, it seemed, had its own ideas about who would take the final bow. The spectral headless horseman, an avatar of the Dreycott House raw, untamed hunger, advanced on Marla Jensen. Its movements were unnervingly fluid, a nightmare of dark fabric and gleaming steel. Marla, her face a mask of disbelief and dawning terror, stumbled back, her carefully constructed composure shattering like brittle glass. "No, this isn't how the story goes," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "I am the chronicler, the keeper of the pact." "The house writes its own endings, Marla," Pastor Hatch yelled, brandishing the glowing iron key like a weapon. The silver amulet around his neck pulsed with a faint, protective light. "Aye, and tonight, it craves a different kind of sacrifice." The horseman raised its spectral sword. The shadowy colonial figures that had gathered in the kitchen recoiled, their forms flickering and distorting, as if in fear of this purer, more potent manifestation of the house will. Even the whispers seemed to hold their breath. Marla, desperate, turned to me, her eyes pleading. Daniel, the axe. Use the axe. Fulfill the chapter. It's the only way to appease it. The axe on the floor pulsed with that cold blue light. Its silent song a siren call in my fractured mind. For a horrifying instant, I felt the urge, the need, to pick it up, to swing it, to become the monster the house wanted me to be. The scent of blood, the phantom weight of the handle in my grip. Daniel, don't! Clara screamed, grabbing my arm. Her grip surprisingly strong, her eyes filled with a fierce determination, locked with mine. Don't let it win. Don't become another page in its damned book. Her voice, her touch. It was an anchor in the maelstrom. The blue haze receded from my vision. I looked at Marla, at the advancing horseman, at the terrified, silent Eli Dreycott cowering in the corner. This wasn't my story to fulfill. As the horseman's sword began its downward arc, Eli, with a choked sob, suddenly darted forward. He wasn't a warrior, just a terrified boy. But he threw himself at Marla, not to save her, but to shove something into her hands. A small, intricately carved wooden effigy, a crude representation of a headless rider. The offering, the true offering, Eli stammered, tears streaming down his face. Grandfather said, always have a substitute. If the house turns. Marla stared at the effigy, then at the descending sword. In that split second, the horseman's unseen gaze seemed to shift, to focus on the wooden figure in her grasp. The sword paused, inches from her throat. A low, guttural growl, like the sound of grinding stones, emanated from the horseman. The air crackled. The effigy in Marla's hands began to smoke, then burst into spectral, cold blue flames. Marla screamed, dropping it as if it were white-hot iron. The horseman, its attention now fixed on the burning effigy, seemed to solidify for a moment. Then, with a sound like 1,000 dry leaves skittering across cobblestones, it began to dissipate, its form dissolving into swirling black mist, the scent of sulfur and grave mold fading with it. The shadowy colonial figures flickered and vanished. The oppressive silence of the Dreycott House returned, heavier and more profound than before. Marla collapsed onto the floor, sobbing, her meticulously crafted world in ruins. Pasta Hatch, leaning heavily against the doorframe, let the glowing key fall from his trembling fingers. It landed on the stone floor with a dull thud, its light extinguishing. The house, it has fed. He wheezed, his face ashen. For now, but it will hunger again. There was no victory, only a temporary, terrifying reprieve. We didn't know if Eli's desperate act with the effigy was a true banishment, or merely a postponement. The axe still lay on the floor, inert now, its blue glow gone, but its presence a chilling reminder of what I had almost become. Clara helped Pasta Hatch to a chair. Eli remained huddled in the corner, shaking. I looked at Marla, a broken, whimpering woman, her grand designs of controlling Sleepy Hollow's dark heart reduced to ash. There would be no cult to round up, no grand conspiracy to expose to a world that would never believe it. There was only the house and its insatiable ancient hunger. We didn't call the police. What would we tell them? The town archivist had a bad night. We dragged Marla, incoherent and babbling about broken packs and unwritten legends, to her car, and with a grim sort of satisfaction, left her slumped over the steering wheel in front of her own neat little house in the center of Sleepy Hollow. Let the town deal with its own. Pastor Hatch, recovering some of his strength, insisted on performing a hasty whispered blessing over the Dreycott House, using the last of his holy water and the now inert silver amulet. It won't hold it forever, he muttered. Nothing does, but perhaps it will buy a little silence. As dawn approached, a sickly gray light filtering through the grimy windows, Clara, Eli, and I stood in the ruined kitchen. Roy and I stood in the ruined kitchen. The bloodstains were still there, a testament to a night of impossible horrors. What now? Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. I picked up the axe. It felt just like an axe now. Heavy, cold, inanimate, but I knew what it was capable of. What I was capable of, under the house influence. I carried it out to the woodshed, found the darkest, deepest corner, and buried the axe head under a pile of rotting logs, hoping it would stay there. We leave, I said, and we pray this chapter stays unwritten. We left Sleepy Hollow that morning, Pastor Hatch in Clara's car, Eli Dreycott choosing to stay, a silent, solitary guardian in his ancestral, accursed home, perhaps understanding his role now more than ever. Marla Jensen was found by her neighbors later that day, incoherent and institutionalized shortly thereafter. Her ravings about Headless Horseman and broken packs dismissed as a sudden, tragic mental breakdown. The Dreycott House stood silent, brooding, its secrets once again locked within its decaying walls. Clara and I parted ways at a bus station 100 miles south. The shared trauma was a bond, but also a chasm. Some horrors are too vast to bridge. She dedicated herself to her history, focusing on forgotten local legends, searching for other places where the veil between worlds was thin, determined to understand, to warn. I tried to go back to my old life, or what was left of it. I wrote a book, not about debunking, but about the genuine, inexplicable terror I'd faced in the Dreycott House. It was published by a small, obscure press, categorized as speculative fiction. Critics called it a vivid, if unsettling, portrayal of psychological collapse. No one believed it was real. Perhaps that was for the best. But Sleepy Hollow and the Dreycott House never truly left me. I'd wake in the dead of night, the phantom sensation of an axe handle in my grip, my palms sweating. On quiet, windy nights, I'd sometimes hear, very faintly, the distant thunder of riderless hooves. The 28-day rule became an obsession. I found myself meticulously counting days in any new place I stayed, a low-grade anxiety thrumming beneath the surface. One evening years later, I was in a dusty antique shop in a forgotten corner of New England. My eyes fell upon a small tarnished silver disc on a leather thong, identical to the one Pastor Hatch had given me. Next to it, on a faded velvet cloth, lay a heavy, intricately designed iron key. My blood ran cold. The shopkeeper, a wizened old man with eyes that seemed to see too much, smiled. Ah, a connoisseur of unique history, are we? These came from an old estate auction up near the Hudson Valley. Sleepy Hollow, I believe. They say they belong to a rather unfortunate schoolmaster. Always looking over his shoulder, poor fellow. I bought them, of course. I didn't know why. Perhaps as a reminder. Perhaps as a ward. That night, I woke up, standing in the middle of my dark apartment. I wasn't holding an axe, but clutched in my hand, so tightly my knuckles were white, was the cold, heavy iron key, and from the street outside my window, clear as a funeral bell in the quiet night, came the unmistakable sound of a single horse, galloping hard, approaching fast. There was no rider. The house always needs a story, and some chapters, I realized with a chilling certainty, never truly end. They just wait for a new hand to turn the page, a new victim to pick up the pen, or the axe, and the whispers of Sleepy Hollow, I knew then, would echo in my soul for whatever remained of my own, perhaps already written, lifeline.